Years ago, I was at a forum that was organized by the League of Women Voters, which unfortunately doesn't exist in GR anymore. And they had invited the editor of the Grand Rapids Press to come speak to them. And he began his talk by saying that the function of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Well, as many of you are well aware of, this is not exactly what governs the news media in Grand Rapids. Just last week alone, the press ran 2 stories on the same day that could have been potentially great stories if they had asked questions other than just reporting official sources. Both of them had to do with money and elections. The first one was a comment from local businessman Fred Meyer, and this is what Fred had to say. Campaign contributions get people to listen to our point of view. If we're not there, legislators could come up with a solution that's harmful to what we do. Interesting. The second comment, which was on the front page story, was actually even more disheartening than the first, because this was a quote from a media executive in town. They were talking about the amount of paid political ads that are airing on local TV and radio, and the station manager for Channel 8 said this: if they keep this up, spending week to week, it'll be a slugfest, a real dogfight, and ad buys will continue to increase. Of course it's great. It's a windfall of revenues for us. So unfortunately, this is what dictates journalism, not only here, but across the country. Now, can you imagine if Amy Goodman had been the one on assignment of these stories? And the reporting might have been significantly different, I think it's safe to say. Amy's the host of one of the best news and information shows in the country, Democracy Now! And I remember listening to her interview of President Clinton just weeks before he left office. It was the first time I had ever heard a reporter not loft softballs at an elected official. She grilled him, and rightly so. That's the function of journalism. Amy embodies the real purpose of journalism, which is to challenge and hold accountable those in power, and has even been willing to put her life on the line just to do that. In November of '91, she and her colleague Alan Nairn were nearly beaten to death while reporting on the U.S.-backed repression by the Indonesian military in East Timor. Most recently, she provided and continues to provide the best information analysis to question what has been a constant drumbeat to war since 9/11. Democracy's Now! Show is called Exception to the Rulers because not only will she challenge those in power, but she provides a forum for those who have been marginalized by the corporate media and a voice to those on the ground who are struggling every day for justice. On the jacket of her new book, Exception to Rulers, there's a great quote from former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, which is for me an affirmation of the type of journalism that she practices. It says, "I have advised my mother to talk to no reporters because of people like you." Please join me in welcoming Amy Goodman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to Dirk Koenig and GRTV and the Community Media Center here in Grand Rapids and the Alliance of Community Media. It is so wonderful to be working together, cross platforms from TV to radio, internet, satellite television. The operative word is grassroots, is community, is independent. I come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded 55 years ago, April 15th, 1949, by a World War II conscientious objector named Lou Hill. When he came out of the detention camps, he said there has to be a media outlet that doesn't profit from war, that isn't run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica Radio was born, run by journalists. The professor of journalism, George Goodman, from the University of Pennsylvania, said, "We need media that's not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell that are raising our children today." That's why public media is absolutely critical. You look at the media landscape. During the Persian Gulf War more than 10 years ago, CBS was owned by Westinghouse, NBC was owned by General Electric, two of the major nuclear weapons manufacturers in the world, making most of the parts for most of the weapons in the Persian Gulf War. Was it any accident what we watched on television was a military hardware show? CBS executives quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying, when we move into the commercials, the news reports have to be more upbeat on war, because, you know, blood and toothpaste don't mix. No, we need a media that's independent. After Pacifica was established and the whole idea of listener sponsorship that Pacifica pioneered, that if you appreciate what you hear on Pacifica radio stations and then community radio stations, call in and pledge support so that we don't have to turn to corporations, it truly became a sanctuary for dissent in the country. In the 1950s, the great actor, activist, singer, scholar Paul Robeson, whitelisted from almost every public place in this country, but a few black churches, knew he could be heard on Pacifica Radio. Or James Baldwin, the great writer and civil rights activist, debating Malcolm X and the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins of the South, broadcast over the airwaves of WBAI, where I come from in New York, another Pacifica station. Pacifica Radio grew to 5 stations: New York, Berkeley, KPFA, Los Angeles, KPFK, Washington, WPFW, and Houston, KPFT, which was established in 1970. It's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up, actually twice, in its first year of operation by the Ku Klux Klan. And when the Grand Dragon, or was it the Exalted Cyclops, I always confuse them, went on trial, he said it was his proudest act, because I think he understood how dangerous Pacifica is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone describing their own experience, that breaks down caricatures, stereotypes that fuel hate groups, you wonder how what has happened at the Abu Ghraib prison today could happen. The molestation, the dehumanization, the torture, the humiliation of the Iraqi prisoners. Well, when you don't hear people speaking for themselves, when you just hear one side talking continually about the enemy, anything can happen from that. Media is there as a sanctuary for dissent, to allow people to speak, to communicate. And that's the beauty of community media in this country and all over the world, and why we have to shore it up and challenge the corporate media that allows for the kind of stereotyping and ignorance that spews from that small circle of pundits that we see, I swear, on almost every network. I've become convinced they sit in one room, these pundits who know so little about so much. They sit in this little circle, and they don't even have to move. It's just the logo changes throughout the day, NBC, CBS, ABC, and now they wring their hands and say, how did we get it so wrong? Like around the issues of weapons of mass destruction. Why don't they invite in some of the people who got it right? That's from outside the establishment, but also inside. I mean, how many intelligence experts from the CIA and the State Department were saying from the beginning, oh, there's something terribly wrong here? How many weapons inspectors who'd been to Iraq from the United Nations saying, no, we got those weapons. Now we're saying, well, who could those people be? A lot of them understood what was going on. The heads of the international agencies, like UN Weapons Inspector Hans Blix, like the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed al-Baradei, saying, no, 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 this isn't true. The media just iced them out. And they didn't have to go far to find these people. It wasn't just laziness. It was an absolute dedication to the establishment consensus. And let's not forget that before the invasion this time around, the Democrats joined with the Republicans. That's right, John Kerry, John Edwards. And when you have the Democrats joining with the Republicans, for the corporate media, you have almost no spectrum of dissent. I'm not even going to call it mainstream media anymore. Because if you look at that period leading up to the invasion and the study you saw me quote in the video of FAIR, 3 of 393 interviews done in the 4 major nightly newscasts with anti-war representatives, 3 of almost 400 when most people were opposed to war for inspections and diplomacy. No, that is not a media that represents the mainstream in this country. That is extreme media. And we're not just saying to them, you've got to represent the fringe minority as well. We're not even saying just the silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. And that has got to change. I recently came back from the Central African Republic, and how many of you actually watch Democracy Now! On GRTV? Fantastic. Well, then you possibly watched the reports from there. We started early on. This is, by the way, the bicentennial of the oldest black republic in the world, Haiti, born January 1st, 1804. This was a country born of a slave rebellion. The U.S. always was in one way or another opposed to democracy in Haiti. In the 19th century, because it was born of a slave rebellion, Congress didn't want to recognize it as an independent republic. It might inspire slaves in the United States to rise up. And then you have the first democratically elected president in Haiti at the beginning of 1990s, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and the coup that ousted him from power in 1991 to 1994. I spent a good amount of time in Haiti through those years, determined that during that period, the coup forces were FRAP. That was the paramilitary death squad in Haiti, headed by Emmanuel Constant. You know, Bush leads this war on terror. Well, there is a terrorist walking the streets of New York. He is Emmanuel Constant, responsible for I don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands, of Haitian deaths. But he's protected in this country because he has a lot of beans to spill if he were ever taken into custody. My colleague Alan Nairn exposed in The Nation magazine how he was on the payroll of the intelligence agencies as he was doing his dirty work in Haiti. Well, 10 years later, President Aristide has been ousted once again. But if you just watch the corporate media, you would think there was a popular uprising in Haiti. You wouldn't realize he had been once again elected president of Haiti. Well, on Democracy Now!, we told a very different story because we were talking to people on the ground in Haiti. It wasn't just us talking. It was giving voice to people who were in Haiti. What did we learn? Well, actually, over the weekend of February 28th, 29th, this past February, the events started to get more and more intense. We're talking to Haitian and international reporters on the ground, and they were talking about these rebels that were moving in. The mainstream media talked about these leaders of a popular uprising. Who were these people? Well, let's go back in history. 1988, the Saint-Jean-Bosco Church, a church I visited in Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti. There was a massacre of the congregants, and a fiery young priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was holding a mass, and the congregants were killed. He barely escaped his life. 5 years later, yes, another September 11th, 1993, a procession was held remembering the Saint-Jean-Bosco massacre. And one of those who led this procession was a millionaire Haitian businessman, Antoine Ismery, who'd thrown in his lot with Lavalas, the party that had been swept to power in the first democratic elections. I stayed at his house. And Antoine Ismery, as he was walking in this procession, September 11th, 93, in broad daylight and in cold blood, forced to his knees and executed. The man found guilty in absentia of his murder, Jodel Chamblain, the man who was one of the leaders of this most recent ousting of President Aristide. But you wouldn't know that. You heard about these rebels who were negotiating with the US government. You wouldn't know that he was also found guilty in absentia of the killing just a month later of the justice minister. I remember the picture on the front page of the New York Times of Guy Mallory dead in his own blood on the street, gunned down. Jodel Chamblain, #2 man in FRAP, the paramilitary death squad on the payroll of the intelligence agency, and they're back 10 years later. So there's no one new in this group. And if the media brought us any history, any context, we would know these groups and we would understand exactly what was taking place. Well, throughout the weekend of February 28th, 29th, we were doing special reports, and then on the morning of March 1st, we got frantic calls from U.S. Congressmember Maxine Waters and Trans-Africa founder Randall Robinson. And we had just gone off the air. They said, go back on the air. And because we repeat the show through the morning so that radio stations can get the program throughout the day, as well as public access TV stations, we went right back on the air. And they said, we have just heard from Jean-Bertrand Aristide. See, it somehow disappeared the day before. No one knew where the Aristides were, the First Lady Mildred and the President. Well, after 24 hours of being incommunicado, Maxine Waters said, President Aristide had phoned from the Central African Republic, a remote area of Africa, one plane out a week, hard even to make a telephone call. And he said, I've been the victim of a modern kidnapping in the service of a coup d'etat backed by the United States. And Maxine Waters and Randall Robinson told the story. And because we now broadcast on television, we do closed captioning for the deaf and the hard of hearing to reach 28 million more Americans. And we take the closed captioning transcripts and post them on our website right away. And that morning we posted those transcripts, and reporters took them to the White House and to the Pentagon, and they questioned Donald Rumsfeld and said, is this true what Pacifica is reporting, the modern kidnapping in the service of a US-backed coup d'etat? And Rumsfeld laughed. And they said, we asked for an answer, not a laugh. And he said, that's ridiculous. Well, I've learned in my years as a journalist, when a politician tells you that's ridiculous, you're probably on the right track. And then a few weeks later, in mid-March, Congressmember Waters and Randall Robinson and a member of the Jamaican Parliament, Sharon Hay Webster, and Eris lawyer Eric Kurzban chartered a plane to challenge the most powerful country on earth, the United States, to call its bluff. If Aristide indeed had gone to the Central African Republic, fled, resigned, and just taken up residency, as they said, was a free man to leave, they said they'd call his bluff. If he wasn't a prisoner, then they'd take him back. Well, Democracy Now! Chronicled this trip. I got on this too small plane, and we traveled 2/3 of the way around the world, from Miami to St. Thomas to Dakar, Senegal, to Bangui, Central African Republic. And the small delegation negotiated with the dictator, where the Aristides had been dumped, who had risen to power a year before himself in a coup. The US knows how to choose them. And they negotiated for 7 hours. And as he would go off to think about what to do, President Aristide told me he is most likely calling the US and France to get his marching orders. And at about 3 in the morning, he released the Aristides. And we went back in the car to the plane, and I handed President Aristide a sat phone, and he spoke. Wouldn't have mattered if he just talked to me, but to the world through that sat phone on our website, democracynow.org. See, now when we have a grassroots media that goes across this country and the world, Democracy Now! A couple years ago was broadcasting on several dozen community radio stations, and that was terrific. But now, a few years later, as we've crossed over also into television, we're broadcasting on more than 220 Pacifica radio stations and affiliates, increasingly NPR stations, public access TV stations around the country, satellite television, Free Speech TV, which is Dish Network 9415, the oldest nonprofit TV channel, satellite TV channel in the country, and now on our first PBS station on a Native American reservation, about to get a second. Then we're broadcasting on community radio stations across Australia and across Canada, and video and audio streaming using open source technology on our website, developing a lot of that, and then that becomes a part of the commons, the public commons, so other people can use it. Millions of people are accessing those streams and the very content-heavy website because of all the transcripts and all the segments. When we have that kind of, well, the largest public media collaboration in North America, when President Aristide speaks, or Maxine Waters or Randall Robinson, they know that they can reach a huge audience, unfiltered. We're not just broadcasting the voices of officialdom. And as we traveled then back to this hemisphere, by the way, every step of the way, AP was hooked in, Associated Press, and they were then transmitting our reports all over the world to all of their clients around the world, and that went out to all the newspapers and read on all the TV stations around the world. From AP taking these reports to the corporate network reporters citing Pacifica at the Pentagon, I call this trickle-up journalism. And I think that we can build it more and more, especially in this time when the corporate networks are so vulnerable to criticism because so many people in this country are fed up. Weapons of mass destruction, where? It wasn't just the administration. And, you know, we expect governments to lie, and I'm not just talking about the Bush administration. The great journalist I.F. Stone said it well to journalism students. He said, if you're going to remember two words, remember governments lie. So we know that. But it's when the media acts as a conveyor belt for those lies that we are in very big trouble. Because most people in this country expect that the media is analyzing, filtering, deciding what is right and wrong, researching, investigating. And when it doesn't, I mean, the old Pravda in the Soviet Union, yeah, we knew how it operated. Everyone knew, you read between the lines. You don't believe that state organ. But in this country, well, there's been a different attitude until now. And that's why I think there's this hunger for different voices. I mean, we've traveled around the country now on this insane 70-city tour that seems to be growing every single day. And the response has been absolutely unbelievable. 2,000 people came out in Los Angeles, 1,500 in Minneapolis. We work with many independent bookstores in general, and Louise Erdrich, the Native American writer, owns a bookstore in Minneapolis, and they said that The Exception to the Rulers, the book that my brother David Goodman and I have written, the idea, the exception to the rulers, that that's what media should be, you know, that there's a reason our profession is protected by the Constitution, and the only one that is, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on government. Media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society, if it does act as the exception to the rulers. But they said that the book was hotter than Harry Potter. Now, how can that be? It can be when people are angry. You know, there's this proliferation of books now, and you might wonder why. You've never seen so many books coming out so quickly. I really do think it's because the corporate media has iced out so much dissent. It's the only way to get views out now. there is this proliferation of conservative imprints in the publishing houses afterwards. And by the way, if anyone has the book, if you could bring it up to me, because I wanted to read something from it, and I forgot to bring mine. But I promise not, oh good, we've got one, we've got one. Only Dirk could be the same size as this very tall podium. But this proliferation of conservative imprints, and afterwards we're going to be, I always say we because my brother David is usually with me, but I'll be signing books at the back. And if you get 2 of them, you get the DVD for free, which is not only independent media in a time of war, which you just saw, an amazing production of the Indie Media Center of Hudson Mohawk, upstate New York. Indie Media Centers are also just blossoming around the world, and it's incredible to work with indie media reporters, and it's so important. But they did this incredible job with the speech I gave a year ago up in Troy, New York. I never even realized they were filming it. And then they layered, working a whole collective for many months, layering thousands of video images from the corporate media of their coverage of war. And they have 2 other films on this DVD that are incredibly good. One is the coverage, Indie Media Collaboration coverage of February 15th that we did, the day, remember, 30 million people around the world rocked the globe for peace. And then a women's peace vigil that was kept going consecutive. Every 24 hours another woman would go into a peace center in Albany, New York, and stay for 24 hours and speak to the public or write journals, and anyone could come in and speak. It's a beautiful piece. And they did these pieces and put it on the DVD. It's $30 on our website, but we're offering for free for 2 books. Why 2 books? Well, aside from sending an important message to publishers that people are hungry for something else, and every book that succeeds makes room for another book yet unwritten, but a space. For the publishers, they see it as, oh, there's this market out there. I call it a citizenry that is angry and outraged and wants something else. But it's so important to include bookstores with indie media centers and Pacifica Radio and public access TV and public television together. It's all part of the media landscape in this country that has to be pried open. We have to break the sound barrier. So the end of the story of Haiti, we got on the plane, we're broadcasting what President Aristide had to say first at democracynow.org and then on the show the next day, putting out the transcripts. And this amazing small delegation led by Congressmember Maxine Waters flew back. We went from Bangui, Central African Republic, to Dakar, Senegal, to the Cape Verde Islands, flew over the Atlantic, landed in Barbados, and as we landed, we learned that top-level administration officials, Rumsfeld, Rice, and Powell, were threatening, saying the Aristides were not to return to this hemisphere. Whose hemisphere? And the U.S. ambassador to Haiti, James Foley, saying they're not to return within 150 miles of Haiti, which Jamaica is. Whose country? And yet they did. And they brought President Aristide and the First Lady of Haiti to Jamaica, where they reunited with their 2 small daughters. They'd been invited by the Jamaican Prime Minister. And as Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was going through all that trouble with the 9/11 Commission, you know, the Bush administration not wanting her to speak. Well, they didn't care if she spoke, because she did lots on television, but to speak under oath, which means to speak the truth. It's fine if she spoke, but not under oath. Well, ultimately, because occasionally the media does shine the spotlight in the right direction, she was forced to, or I should say the Bush administration was forced to allow her to. Of course, Bush and Cheney didn't have to abide by that same standard. You know what happened, right? The independent 911 commission goes to the White House. They have to speak together, sitting side by side, make sure they get their story straight, but they don't even have to do it under oath. They aren't transcribed, they aren't recorded, and then as the commissioners leave, their notes are seized or confiscated. This is the independent 9/11 commission. They're coming to New York soon. I bet if it was in Grand Rapids, Dirk and the media center here would have gotten them through their diligence to be able to get that GRTV right in there and been able to record it. But this happened in Washington, where there is a much more tame press, the Washington press. doggedly following or amplifying the establishment consensus. It's so important we have a different media. But that delegation made their way back, and a very different story was told, really living out the dictum of Margaret Mead: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And they delivered them to Jamaica, and now they will be going into asylum in South Africa. Thabo Mbeki, the re-elected president in South Africa, saying that they are a very important voice that must be heard as they then decide their next move. It is so critical we hear from the people closest to the story, that we go to where the silence is, as opposed to what the New York Times did in just quoting the government's version of Aristide resigning and fleeing and taking up residence in the Central African Republic. What did the New York Times assistant managing editor for Standards, Alan Siegel, say when he was asked why they were not more skeptical of the anonymous US government accounts of the removal of Jean-Bertrand Aristide? Siegel said, "There was no reason at that time to be skeptical about it. I don't think there were sources available to give us any other version." Well, if you weren't listening, if you didn't call them up, we need an independent media in this country. And media activism really does work. I always like to tell the story of the Sally Jesse Raphael show. Being on it, believe it or not, during the Persian Gulf War. Do all of you know that show was just recently taken off the air? You know, the women's talk show. It shows the power of mass media. Millions of people, mainly women, watched that show every day. And so I was very surprised, right at the beginning of the Persian Gulf War, when I got a call. Well, I was on WBAI, the Pacifica station. I just finished the news. We were in fundraising, so a lot of volunteers were in taking calls. And one of the volunteers ran in. I was railing against the bombing of the cradle of civilization back to the cradle. And this young woman ran in and said, "Quick, quick, the Sally Jesse Raphael show is online." I said, "Oh, right." And I just kept talking. She kept coming back in. And, you know, volunteers are the heart of community radio. I just thought this one was hallucinating. So she was so persistent, okay, I'll just appease her. "Hello," I said, and there was the producer from the Sally Jesse Raphael show. She said, "Would you like to join us on the program in 2 days?" She said she was listening in her limousine. I guess the chauffeur had turned on the program. And they were going to have a show, 3 women for and against the war, in 2 days. And it would be recorded, and 2 days later they'd air it nationally. So I said, well, okay. I thought about what to wear. Whether to dress as a man, dressed as a woman, dressed as a man, dressing as a woman, dressing as a man. And I figured out what to do, and I went on down, and they had it all set up. There was the pro-war women in one green room and the anti-war women in the other, and we weren't to meet until we went out on the stage, because they really wanted it to be fireworks. The producer said, she came into the green room, and she said, "Please, I just want you to duke it out on the stage. I really want you to express your opinion. I want to prove," she said, "that we can make these kinds of shows work, shows that matter on issues that make a difference." And I thought she was onto something. You know, it doesn't matter if you work in the system or outside the system. What matters is that you can make a difference. You can accomplish what you want, and as long as you can, stay there and do it. And this is how she thought of doing it. So I said, sure. So we went out on the stage. By the way, the other 5 women, two others against, and 3 for, were all military. We went out on the stage, and the show began. The audience was full, the music came up, the lights went on, and Sally came out, and she immediately handed her microphone to someone in the audience. And that woman said, "I'm really concerned about Saddam Hussein having chemical and biological weapons." To which the woman next to me, Dr. Yolanda Hewitt Vaughn, who is an Army captain, trained as a doctor, refusing to go to the Gulf, saying she was trained to save lives, not take them, said, "I share your concern. But I think it's very important to point out that we have chemical and biological weapons right here in the United States." And before she could get out the word States, Sally whirled around,
she started barreling down the aisle, and she was shouting, "You be quiet, you shut up, this is my show, or you get out." Now, I hadn't really seen the show, and she is coming down at such a velocity. And I was thinking of this woman saying, "I really want you to duke it out." And I was thinking, you know, the whole Jerry Springer thing where they really do. I was going, oh my God. And she is racing down to the stage. And I mean, Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn was this petite woman wearing a long black dress, hair tied back, big glasses, hands clasped in her lap, very soft-spoken. I thought she was going to strike Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn. So as she is coming up on the stage, I said, "Whoa, Sally, back off." Well, now, you know, the audience, some of the people there were from WBAI. They had told us to bring our friends, and they started chanting, "Free speech, free speech." You can dress them up, but you can't take them anywhere. So, anyway, Sally started to break down. And she stopped the taping of the show. Her producers came out, and they started to rock her back and forth right there. My God. It was the one moment of unity for all 6 women on the stage. We were just looking in shock. I mean, it was as if she had never heard an anti-war view before. Now, if this happens to one person listening, imagine if the media expressed it 2 or 3 or 10 or 100 times. I mean, it could shake the world. But there was Sally, they're cradling her and saying, "It's okay, Sally, it's okay." God. And somehow they convinced her to carry on with the taping of the show. Oh, well, there was one caveat. We would have to raise our hands if we had anything to say. Now, I had never seen this before. I mean, the guests, except maybe on Sesame Street. But we agreed, and we continued with the taping. So, then Sally showed videotape of the protesters in Washington, and she asked me, "Who are these people?" Now, I didn't know everyone's name, but I don't know. Were one of you there then, Persian Gulf War? Okay, I'm going to remember your name next time, but I applauded her for going beyond the video. In our luckiest days, the media will at least show the protest, although that's pretty rare too. But she was going beyond and inviting people in to have a civilized discussion. I mean, why do people go out on the streets? Then it was the middle of winter, freezing cold. Why do they leave the warmth of their homes and their families and their TV sets to go outside, to travel many miles by train or by plane or by car? I said, well, it's to practice their patriotic duty, what they think is their civic duty. And they gather together because they are not invited into the corporate network studios, like someone like Henry Kissinger, right? Who's invited in very frequently to talk about why he supports every invasion. No, they don't get that chance. And so they gather together outside in the freezing cold, and they can only hope on a global warming day. A CBS executive will open a window, and that chant of no war will waft in and maybe hit an open microphone. But Sally actually invited some people in. So I said, congratulations to Sally. And we moved on, and we talked about lots of issues. We talked about the Middle East. I said, as the granddaughter of an Orthodox rabbi, I'm horrified to see little Israeli children wearing gas masks. But I'm more horrified to see little Palestinian children not wearing gas masks. And that's the kind of conversation we had for the hour. My grandfather died years ago, but my grandmother, we just celebrated her 107th birthday a few weeks ago. It's hard to think that she was, already, 55. She was like 52 years old when Pacifica was established 55 years ago. Wow. But anyway, that's how the show went. And at the end of it, the cameraman gave me a thumbs up, and we went back to BAI, and we waited the 2 days for the show to air, and it didn't air. And I called up, and I asked why, and the producer said, oh, funny you should call. There was a technical problem with the syncing of the video and the sound tracks. All right. And so I said, come on, you know it's a problem with the sound of our voices. And she said, don't be like that. We'll have you back another time. said, no, I know that's not going to happen. And I said, and you know it can't happen, because Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn is going to jail. She was court-martialed. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison right after this. And recently, I was signing books in St. Louis, celebrating the radio and TV station there, DHTV and KDHX radio. And after the talk, I was doing the signing, and a young man came up, and I wrote "Dear," and looked up, and I said, well, what's your name? And he said, Emiliano Hewitt-Vaughn. He was Dr. Yolanda Hewitt-Vaughn's son, small at the time. She was imprisoned for 8 months, and then Amnesty International declared her a prisoner of conscience, and that put pressure, and she was ultimately freed from the brig. And Emiliano, in high school, set up his first Amnesty chapter because he saw how powerful it could be. It had liberated his mother. But anyway, I said to them, you know, it's not going to happen. She's going to jail. So, and I said, how, by the way, did you find out about this technical problem? And they said, well, we sent out the video, and Minneapolis and Chicago stations called, said it was unusable. So I called those stations. I said I was a concerned viewer. I asked to speak to the operations director, not the most popular person, so I was able to get right through. And I said, what about that Sally show on war? And they said, that's odd that you would know about it, they said, because it was pulled by New York, and we're scrambling to get another show. So I called back the Sally Jesse Raphael show and said, the jig is up. I'd like to speak to the executive producer. They said, he's a very busy man. People were calling us at BAI, and I said, don't bog down our switchboard. I don't know why they're not airing it, though I suspected. I said, why don't you call them if you want to know? And I guess they got a ton of calls. I mean, more than that, a lot of calls. Because years later, I bumped into a producer in an elevator somewhere, and she said, those calls shut down the Sally Jesse Raphael show for 2 days. Media activism really matters. All I know is that 2 days later, I got a call from a very frantic high-level producer who said, the executive producer would like to speak to you now. I said, I'm a very busy woman. They asked if I would cry censorship if they edited the program. And I said, of course not. I'm an editor too. You have every right. As Sally said, it is her show. And I expect that you would edit out her fit. And they did, and the show ran the next day. But because they held on to it, it ran with headlines around the country that said, things get messy with Sally Jesse. And the most interesting response that I got was from women on Southern military bases who called to say, we've never heard this view on television, and we agree with you. These were women who were going to war, or their loved ones were. They were being sent to kill or be killed. I don't know which is worse. And they said they can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the most important discussions of the day about war and peace, about life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country. I see the media, all the public access TV stations and radio stations, as a huge kitchen table that stretches across this country, that we all sit around and debate and discuss these critical issues. That is media serving a democratic society. There is so much that we have to do right now. The horror that we see in Iraq, I hold the media partly responsible for. I think the media has reached an all-time low in this country. I mean, you know, these pictures we're seeing out of the prison, these horrific pictures of torture and humiliation and degradation, abuse. the whole world is horrified. You know how they say the Arab world is repulsed? Come on, this is not an Arab thing. Some special gene they have, an oversensitive gene. My God, this is a human thing. And everyone, everywhere, is disgusted, is horrified. And it's the power of the pictures. And if we had seen the pictures of the casualties of war, like you saw in this videotape, a year ago with the invasion, the kids dead on the ground, women, their legs blown off from cluster bombs, Americans are a compassionate people. They would have said no long ago, that war is not a civilized answer to conflict in the 21st century. But if they don't see what's going on, and Americans, like people all over the world, are smart. But when you have the gray, grainy images with the target on them that look like a video game, and the playing cards as they're going after the Iraqi officials with the picture in them, and the media shows the whole playing card. I mean, Victoria Clark, right, the spokesperson for the Pentagon who hailed from that global PR firm, Hill and Knowlton, said the embedding process was a spectacular success. And the playing cards, I mean, the Pentagon said it went beyond their wildest imaginings. They didn't expect the press was going to show the whole card. Cards, video games, I mean, kids know it more than anyone. And they're the ones who are growing up. They'll be the next generation of decision makers. Looks like fun. War looks like fun, but of course it isn't. It is horror, it is gore, it is hell, it is death. And if we saw that honestly, as opposed to Aaron Brown saying that these images are tasteless, that once the war is on, these voices are irrelevant. I mean, how would war end? And now, we finally see some pictures, and everyone says, no, this has got to stop. It just proves the point why independent media, which has been showing these images, why it is absolutely critical, and why the internet, in the service of society, when it is still public, we must use it, or we are going to lose it. In the same way that we have to really get community involved with public access television, because after the cable monopolies come in and they dig up a road and either AOL Time Warner gets the video franchise or the cable franchise in a town, or Adelphia or Comcast or Cablevision, after they get it and they give over a few public interest channels to appease the community, a few years later they renegotiate. And if people aren't deeply involved in their public access TV channel, they won't have the necessary people at the city council or the legislature or whatever you call your community decision-making body saying, no, you can't take 2 of our public interest channels away. If we're involved, if we're making our own media, if we're seeing the effects it can have in a community, then it wouldn't be possible. And it's why GRTV is so important, why the Alliance of Community Media that links people all over the country is so important. It's why we have to make our own media and get word out. And yes, community media can be the model for the corporate media, can lead the way, because people now are angry. There is a moment every once in a while, there is a window that opens where people are really open to other ideas. I think that labels like conservative and progressive, liberal and right-wing and left-wing, I think that's all breaking down right now. I mean, conservatives, like progressives, are deeply concerned about corporate control of our lives. I mean, I consider myself conservative in many ways, going back to basic values of community and family, defining family in many different ways, but people caring about each other. And conservatives, like progressives, are concerned about privacy issues and concerned about this insane budget that is going, I won't even say to Iraq, because it isn't. It is just going as corporate welfare to these huge multinational corporations like Bechtel and Halliburton. It's just a way of funneling the money there. They are spending many times more money giving them to those corporations than they are on homeland security here at home. And all of the millions of people who've lost their life savings and people who worked at, say, Enron, they see the corporate heads going scot-free, making more and more millions, for example, for the Bush administration campaign contributions like Kenny Boy, right? That's what Bush called him until he got into a little trouble, and now he calls him Mr. Lay, but one of his pioneers that raised so much money for his campaign. He goes scot-free. The Democratic campaign fundraiser, Martha Stewart, she gets in deep trouble. But he goes scot-free, and who did he affect? Well, I mean, thousands of workers who lost their life savings. So people across the political spectrum are angry. They are fed up. And it's so important that we recognize this and understand all different alliances are taking place, and I'm sure you find it in your own communities. I come from, well, Ground Zero, New York, just blocks from where the towers of the World Trade Center once stood. September 11, 2001, a horrific moment when 3,000 people were incinerated in an instant. We'll never know how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death, and they're the undocumented workers who were working at the World Trade Center. But September 11th is a significant date for people all over the world, other September 11ths. I talked about September 11th, 88, the Saint Jean Bosco Church in Haiti in 93 when Antoine Ismarie was killed. There's other September 11ths, and we have to have a global perspective to understand why people feel the way they do. September 11th, 1990, we write about in The Exception to the Rulers, the day that the Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack was killed by US-backed Guatemalan security forces. September 11th, 1973. Salvador Allende, the democratically elected leader in Chile, died in the palace. In fact, on September 11, 2001, when the second plane hit the second tower of the World Trade Center, we were broadcasting Democracy Now! At that time. We used to broadcast at 9, now we broadcast at 8. So that plane hit, and we didn't even know what had happened right outside the old firehouse we work out of, Engine Company 31, that's now a community media center. We didn't know what had happened because we had no windows in the garret where we used to work. And it was happening down the street. We were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973, when Salvador Allende died in the palace. When the US-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed Pinochet forces, the Kissinger-backed Pinochet forces rose to power, killing thousands of Chileans over that 17-year iron-fisted rule of Pinochet. That's their September 11th. And then there's September 11th, 1977, when Steve Biko, the father of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, was being beaten to death in the back of a van by US-backed apartheid forces. He died in the early hours of September 12th. September 11th, 1971, Attica uprising, when the prisoners rose up against the prison conditions. 2 days later, then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller called in the state troopers, and they opened fire, killing 39 men, wounding 88 others. September 11, 2001 isn't the first time terror came to our shores. Ask any African American about slavery. Ask any Native American about what has happened in this country. But it was horrible. It was horrible. And we should know everyone's name who died. After that day, we stayed in the firehouse. We kept on broadcasting. We had just started, in those days, we just started doing TV, believe it or not, just a pure coincidence. The local public access TV station, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, a day before September 11th had said, could we start broadcasting your radio show? I mean, could we start putting it on to MNN? I said, well, what would it involve? As long as it doesn't put a hum into our radio show, I guess you could do whatever you want. And they said, no, we probably could work it out. So they put one camera on us, and there was a direct link from our media center to Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And so through this period, we started to broadcast on television. It's absolutely incredible, really. And we stayed in the firehouse. We knew we'd be thrown out of the whole area. We were so close to Ground Zero. The military had taken over. The police were right outside. It was an evacuation zone. And late at night, I would walk outside, and amidst all the ash, who knew what we were breathing, we had gas masks on, and Started to see those pictures going up everywhere, dozens and hundreds of those color Xeroxes of the photographs of people lost at the World Trade Center, and they'd see things like a picture of a young woman. If you've seen my daughter, last seen on the 44th floor of the World Trade Center, please call her mother. Or a picture of a man holding his child. If you've seen my husband, please call his wife, with a phone number, last seen in Tower 1 on September 11th. And I thought about how similar those pictures were to those carried by the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, in the Plaza de Mayo. Those pictures pasted to placards that said, "Have you seen my granddaughter? Have you seen my grandson?" September 11th united all of us, all over the world, against terror. I do think that Osama bin Laden and his accomplices should be tried for what happened on September 11th and, if found guilty, severely punished. But I also think that Henry Kissinger should be tried for war crimes and, if found guilty, severely punished. We have to have a universal standard of justice. And we see what happens when we don't. The anger that it engenders, Bush unsigning the International Criminal Court Treaty, the ICC treaty. I mean, Clinton didn't do much better. He signed it on the last day he possibly could. But then Bush immediately unsigned it and said, this court is fine for others, but not for U.S. soldiers and U.S. officials. Fine for them, not for us. No, that is not acceptable. We have to be clear, we have to be just, and that sense of justice I think people share all over the world. When President Bush came to Ground Zero a few days later, and you heard that chant go up around him, USA, USA, it sent a chill through me. I don't think that's the answer to what happened on September 11th. It's a global community united against terror. That's the answer. There were so many people in those days who lost loved ones who did not believe that retaliation was the answer. The media personalities on television, you can't call them journalists, intoning that figure, 90% of Americans are for war. Were any of you called? And if you were, what were you asked? Because if you were asked, do you believe the killing of innocent civilians should be avenged by the killing of innocent civilians? Of course, most Americans would say no, more than 90%. And there were many who did, immediately. People like Rita Lasar, 70 years old, who lost her brother Abe Zalmanowitz on the 27th floor of the World Trade Center. He could have gotten out, but he was working next to his best friend Ed, who is a paraplegic. He said, "I'm just going to wait until the emergency workers come for Ed." His brother was screaming at him on the cell phone, "Get out now, get out now." He said, "As soon as they come, we'll go down together." And he died with so many others. In fact, when Bush gave his speech at the National Cathedral, he invoked Abe's story, talked about him as a hero. And when he did, Rita said no. And she wrote a letter to the New York Times that actually got published. And she said, even as she knew the worst pain of her life, it would only increase her suffering to know that a sister in Afghanistan would soon lose her brother. She said, "Not in my name, not in my brother's name." Or Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son, Gregor Nestor Rodriguez, above the 100th floor. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. 600 of 1,000 workers died on that day. And they too wrote a letter to President Bush. Didn't get published anywhere, but it swirled around the internet. And they said it would not lessen their pain to know that soon a mother and father in Afghanistan would lose their son. They said, not in our name, not in our son's name. And a nationwide movement grew up, not in our name, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. But we heard very little about it in the corporate press. Yet there were many who felt that way. Instead, we actually saw these people in the corporate media describing their loved ones, and they were heroes. But when they went from description to prescription, what they thought should happen, they cut away. and they went to the experts on terrorism, the Oliver Norths and the Henry Kissingers. Well, maybe they got it right in that case. You know, the terrorism experts, it takes one to know one. And I don't say that lightly at all. I mean, just 2 days ago, for those of you who are Democracy Now! Devotees, do you remember hearing Al and Celeste Zappala on Democracy Now!? Incredibly moving. They lost their son, Sherwood Baker, April 26th, a soldier in Iraq, killed in Baghdad, a factory explosion. And I met Al 2 days ago in Philadelphia. I was speaking at the Free Library of Philadelphia, another part of the independent media landscape that we have to preserve. Our libraries are so important. Spaces where we can all gather together. It doesn't matter how much money you have, where we can get information, where we can talk and converse. I grew up at a library down the street. It was like my living room. My dad sat on the library board for 25 years. I can't believe I don't whisper my whole life because I spent so much time in the library. Actually, I think they wished I whispered a little more. But so I was at the library, and they were in the audience, Al Zappala, who lost his son. And he came on the show, and this was so interesting. They lost their son, and there was big stories on them in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they're against the war. He was the first Pennsylvania National Guardsman to die since 1945. And CNN followed them around. They interviewed them. I mean, in the midst of their pain, they had to sit down for this interview and go on and imagine what it's like to just get immersed in their son's life and how painful that is. But they do it for a reason, and came on our show for a reason, because they have something very important to say. And they go through the pain and the suffering. I mean, this is what important TV can be about, so that they can share something with people. They can speak through their tears and convey an important message, who their beautiful son was, and also how they feel about war. Well, the CNN piece didn't exactly air when they said it would. It was supposed to be a big profile just the other day, because Donald Rumsfeld was speaking, so they cut away to him. And then it ended up airing at, I think they said something like 6:30 in the morning on Saturday. And there was a 45-second clip, I think, of Celeste saying her son's name, but not saying anything about the second part, from description to prescription, how they felt about what was happening in Iraq. And then you hear about Nicholas Berg, the man who was just beheaded, 26 years old. My God, it is so horrible. I can't stop thinking about it. I haven't really seen the pictures, but I keep going through it. It's as if I have seen it. And I can't stop seeing this video image. And you know how some of the senators, particularly Republican senators, keep invoking it and saying, you're so concerned about the Iraqi prisoners, what about this horrific event? And I was in Buffalo last night celebrating the radio station that was airing Democracy Now! In a local independent bookstore called Talking Leaves. And right before I spoke, I went over to Adelphia. They have a call-in show. And the first guy that called in said, what about this? What about Nick? You're talking about these prisoners. And I said, I'm glad you raised Nick. It is important. Have you heard his father speak? Michael Berg? Have you heard what he has to say? By the way, you know that Nick was, their family business is putting up low-power FM stations. And they say that that's why he was in Iraq as an independent contractor, just assessing the telecommunications system. But anyway, have you heard Michael Berg speak? You know what he said? He said, my son died for the sins of Bush and Rumsfeld. So suddenly, there's a little problem. The Bush administration is trying to use this horrific beheading of Nick to divert attention from what happened at Abu Ghraib. The fact is, both are horrific. And if we allow the torture that happened in Abu Ghraib to happen, every serviceman in the world is endangered, not to mention every American everywhere, because that sets a model. We're the most powerful country on earth. But we're not hearing now from the parents. And did you know that when their son's body was brought home to Dover Air Force Base on Wednesday, they were not allowed to meet it, to meet the casket? And that was confirmed by the Pennsylvania Republican Senator Arlen Specter, and he confirmed that the Pentagon forbid them from going. So they have a very different message than the Bush administration wants, and you expect the Bush administration would want to clamp down. That's not a surprise. But that the media goes along with this. Everyone should know what Michael Berg is saying, whether you agree or not. That's not the important point. But this is what this grieving family is saying, and we don't hear it. No, we should know. And it shouldn't just be the Henry Kissingers and Oliver Norths who are defining this debate. Yes, Henry Kissinger, who's responsible for so much suffering in the world. Yes, what happened in Chile and Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, millions of people, including tens of thousands of US servicemen, and then Indonesia. And I always end my talks on Timor. How many of you know the story of East Timor? Well, that's very impressive. And I bet it's because you have a community media center, community radio, and community television here in Grand Rapids. And also, perhaps, you have another link, and that is because it was President Ford who went with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to Jakarta, Indonesia, December 5th, 1975. You can find some of this over at the library, some of the recordings of his toasting the long-reigning dictator Suharto. That's where we got the recordings for our documentary called Massacre, the Story of East Timor. But Ford and Kissinger went to Jakarta December 5th, 1975, and they gave the green light for Indonesia's invasion of Timor. 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. When Kissinger flew back to the United States, the US was monitoring the invasion, and State Department officials were sending Kissinger cables. The Congress is going to cut off aid to Indonesia, they were saying, because we're not going to be able to justify bloody invasion. It's an offensive act. They can't use US weapons. And when he got back here, he held a high-level meeting of State Department officials, Kissinger did, and he castigated them for leaving a paper trail, said, "We will not kick our ally in the teeth." The note-taker for that meeting was Jerry Bremer, the nickname for L. Paul Bremer, who learned well at his master's knee, now the overseer for the United States in Iraq. So Indonesia invaded by land, by air, by sea, December 7th, 75, closed the country to the outside world, Timor, 300 miles above Australia, and started just massacring the people. One of the great genocides of the 20th century, proportionately worse genocide than Pol Pot's Cambodia. 17 years they closed the country to the outside world, and I got a chance to go there in 1990 and then again in 91 with my colleague Alan Nairn. In 91, he was writing for the New Yorker magazine, and I was doing a documentary for Pacifica. November 12th, 91, we went to a cemetery, followed a procession of thousands of Timorese who were protesting yet another young man who'd been killed by the Indonesian military. And when they got to the cemetery, it was a cross-section of Timorese society. It's incredible that they had marched on this day. I mean, this was a land of no freedom of expression, no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press. And yet they defied the Indonesian army just by walking peacefully through that geography of pain that was Dili, the capital. Every other building, a military barracks or a police station, even hotels, Timorese were tortured at the back. And they marched, and they got to the cemetery, thousands of them, and we're asking people, why are you doing this? Why are you risking your life just to walk? And an old woman in traditional Timorese garb would say, for my daughter, a girl in her Catholic school uniform, for my father, boys in their shorts, for my village that was wiped off the face of the earth. And then we saw from the direction the procession had come, hundreds of Indonesian soldiers carrying their US M16s at the ready position. The people were trapped, walls on either side of the road. 12 to 15 soldiers abreast, marching. People got very quiet, and Alan suggested we walk to the front of the crowd. We knew they had committed many massacres in the past, but never before in front of Western journalists, and we thought maybe if we took out all of our equipment and I held up my microphone and put my headphones on, we always hid it because it would have endangered the Timorese if we were just interviewing them and Indonesian military saw they would be taken because they were talking to Western journalists. But this time we wanted to make clear, and Alan put the little camera above his head, and we walked to the front of the crowd. The soldiers marched up, and they rounded the corner, and without any hesitation or provocation, without any warning, they just swept past us, and they opened fire on the crowd, gunning people down from right to left. First to go down, a little boy behind us exploded as his hands were up in the V sign from the gunfire, and they just kept on shooting. I was holding my microphone up, and one of the soldiers took it and waved it in my face as if to say, this is what we don't want, and he slammed me to the ground, and others joined in kicking me and using their rifle butts. Alan got a photograph of them opening fire, and he threw himself on top of me to protect me from further injury, and they took their US M16s like baseball bats, and they slammed them against his skull until they fractured it. So we were lying in the road. They were killing everyone around us. And a group of them joined in firing squad fashion, and they put the guns to our heads, and they were screaming, "Politique, politique," in Australia, Australia, politique, because to witness something like this was political. And yet that is our job, is to bear witness. And they were screaming Australia because, well, 17 years before, when Indonesia first invaded, there were 6 reporters from 2 Australian TV stations that were covering the events leading up to the invasion. They took 5 of them and they executed them against a house, and the 6th, Roger East, reporting for The World from a radio station in Dili the day after the invasion, they dragged him out, and as he shouted, "I'm from Australia," they shot him into the harbor. So as they shouted at us laying in the ground, "Australia," we said, "No, America, America." Actually, the Australian government had hardly protested after these killings, and maybe that was explained because years later, Indonesia and Australia would sign the Timor Gap Treaty, dividing up Timor's oil between Indonesia and Australia. Oil is the source of so much pain in the world. So we shouted back, "America, America." They'd stripped us of everything now, and the only thing I had was my passport, and I threw it at them, and somehow we convinced them. And finally, they pulled the guns from our heads. We think because we were from the same country their weapons were from, they would have to pay a price for killing us that they never had to pay for killing the Timorese. And they moved on. We were able to get into a Red Cross Jeep, and dozens of Timorese jumped on top of us and hung on to the Jeep. And we drove like that as a human mass to the hospital. When we got to the hospital, the doctors and nurses started to cry when they saw us. We were not in worse shape than the Timorese. They killed more than 270 Timorese that day. But I think they started to cry when they saw us. Alan was covered in blood because of what we represent. That's Americans, what we represent to the rest of the world, not just to the people of Timor. We represent 2 things. We represent the sword and the shield. The sword, because the US government has provided so many military weapons to repressive regimes, but also the shield. They see American people as, well, really being able to accomplish so much. We come from the most powerful country on earth. I mean, about a couple years ago, I was doing a show on globalization, interviewing this woman from Guyana. And at the end of our conversation, I said, "Thanks so much." We were moving on to another segment on the US elections. And she said, "And I'll be staying for that." And I said, "Well, actually, we're done with this conversation, but we have other guests for the US election." She said, "I'll be one of those guests." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I think everyone in the world should get to vote for the President of the United States." And you think about that. That person has so much effect all over the world. And we, just as American citizens and people who live here who are not citizens, every little thing we do has an enormous ripple effect. And whether you care about presidential politics and voting, it's just horrible in this country that most people don't vote. I mean, people in Timor died for the right to vote, and Haiti died for the right to vote. African Americans here died for the right to vote. But maybe that will change when people feel that the leaders who are running for president really do represent them. And that starts at the local level, being involved in your community. And that's the power of community media, because it gets you involved in so many different issues. It's why it's so important and why it matters to the rest of the world. But so on that day, November 12th, 1991, they saw that shield bloodied, and it just deepened their despair. I think here, being in Grand Rapids, about the nuns, the Dominican nuns from Grand Rapids. Talking about shields and what people can accomplish. In the early morning hours of October 6th, 2002, I always remember October 6th because it was my father's birthday, Dominican sisters Ardith Platte, Carol Gilbert, and Jackie Hudson cut a chain link fence and entered an active missile silo site in northern Colorado, poured blood in the shape of crosses onto the lid of the silo and prayed. 45 minutes later, the three were handcuffed face down and arrested for their actions. For the sisters, bringing attention to the atrocities of nuclear war was a sacred act. For the government, it was something much different. The women were charged with obstruction of national defense and depredation of government property, crimes that carry a maximum sentence of 30 years. The sisters, longtime members of the activist group Plowshares, planned their protest as Iraq's elusive weapons of mass destruction were becoming grounds for a U.S. invasion. You know what happened when they were being sentenced? Planes flew that carried banners that said, weapons, I can't remember exactly, but I think it said they flew over sites that had weapons of mass destruction right here. But you know, we often don't hear about the Plowshares movement in this country. When people like Ardith and Carol, amazing women who come from right here, I've covered some of their actions. One, I was with my colleague Jeremy Scahill at the Air Force Base, Anderson Air Force Base, where the president's plane is, and we were arrested with them because they said to be covering them was to be part of them, and we were investigated by JAG and military and held incommunicado. But they ultimately, I mean, you see now they're in jail, but what they accomplish is people all over the world know that Americans care and are willing to risk their lives or their freedom to make a difference in the world. And that's why I think it's because of people like them that people around the world do see us as the shield, see what can be accomplished. So you fast forward 10 years, and Alan and I went back to Timor in 2002. A nationwide movement grew up in this country to stop the selling of military weapons to Indonesia. An amazing group called the East Timor Action Network that educated so many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in this country. They just kept at it all the time. But in 2002, we went back to Timor for an amazing moment. And that was the people of East Timor celebrating their independence. On May 20th, 2002, May 19th at midnight, 100,000 Timorese gathered in a sandy plain outside of Dili, the capital. And the founding president of Timor, the longtime rebel leader who'd been imprisoned for years by the Indonesian military, Shanano Gusmao, ascended the stage and unfurled the flag of the Democratic Republic of East Timor. And the people looked up, and there was a huge fireworks display. And you could see the light reflected in their tear-stained faces. This nation of survivors had prevailed. They had resisted, and they had won. And they knew that they had done it themselves, but also with the support of people all over the world, no matter their political stripe, who once they learned what was happening, when the media finally shed a spotlight on what was happening in Timor, people revolted all over, and they said no to their governments providing weapons for the Indonesian military. And the people of Timor understood they had accomplished this, and they had accomplished it with a community of goodwill all over the world. And it's such an important lesson to all of us. And it's one that I carry with me all the time, that every day, every hour of every day, whoever we are, journalists, media activists, teachers, scholars, students, doctors, nurses, nuns, employed, unemployed, politicians, whoever, we have a decision to make every day. And that is whether we want to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy now. Thank you.